Welcome to the 8-Minute Devotion with Pastor Cameron Walcott. The 8-Minute Devotion is a daily message that exists to give you hope, encouragement, and life as we look together at the Word of God. And now, the 8-Minute Devotion.
Hello. Welcome back to the 8-Minute Devotion. So glad that you can join us here on this Tuesday as we continue our study of the dwelling places of God. We're looking to see that God desires to dwell with his people, even in the midst of the virus, even in the midst of COVID-19. The Lord is with us. The Lord is with those who love him, is with those who seek him. We are the dwelling place of God. So we're looking at some of the dwelling places of God given to us in the scriptures. And right now, this week, we're looking at the tabernacle of David. So as we saw yesterday, God declared that he would be rebuilding the tabernacle of David in the church age, in the New Testament. The reason we believe is because the tabernacle of David had no veil. It showed that God never wanted a veil that separated himself from his people. Today we're going to see something else, and we're going to see how the tabernacle of David was started. What happened at the beginning? What are some of the things that happened at the beginning of the tabernacle? What lesson can we learn from it? So basically, as I mentioned yesterday, what happened was that Israel over time, they backslid, and they turned away from the Lord, and they had a battle with the Philistines where they brought out the Ark of the Covenant, thinking, well, if we just bring out the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence is there, we're going to be victorious. But because the nation had backslid, they brought out the Ark. God did not fight on their behalf. And the ark was stolen. The ark was taken into the Philistines' possession. Over time, of course, the Philistines tried to keep the ark, but they couldn't. The ark of God was too strong. They returned it to the Israelites. But all through the time of Saul, it was just kept to the side. It was kept not at a central place in the life of Israel. And David decided, we need to bring it back. We need to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. We need to bring the ark back so that we can worship God at the ark. You see, David had a passion that would not allow God's presence to stay sidelined. He wanted it to be at the center of the nation. So the people agreed, we need God's presence. And what happens in 1 Chronicles 13, they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. But you see what the Israelites did, and what David was part of this, what they did as they were bringing the Ark was that they carried the ark the same way that the Philistines did. You see, when the Philistines moved the ark away, they put it on an ox cart and they just carried it away. Then they brought it back on an ox cart. The Israelites said, well, that's how the Philistines did it, so that's how they tried to do it. But of course, that went against God's instructions for carrying the ark. God in the law had made it very clear to the Israelites that no one was to touch the ark, that 4 priests were to carry it on poles. That was the way to move the ark. The Israelites didn't carefully follow God's way and God's standard. So what happens in 1 Chronicles 13, 9 and 10 is this. 1 Chronicles 13, 9 and 10, they're bringing the ark up. They are trying to follow God. They're doing it because they want his presence, but yet they're not doing it in his way, in his order. What happens? Verses 9 and 10. And when they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to take hold of the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he struck him down because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. You see, this is quite an extraordinary little passage. This is quite hard to understand at first glance, that Uzzah is bringing the Ark of the Covenant. He's one of those doing what David asked him to. They are doing something that's good in that they're bringing the Ark back to Jerusalem. They're bringing the worship of God back to the center of the nation. But as they're doing it, they don't follow God's way. The oxen stumble, the ark is about to fall down, and Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark. Uzzah reaches out his hand to touch the ark. And what happened right there is that Uzzah died. The Lord struck him down for touching the Ark of the Covenant with his hand. You know, Uzzah probably thought, I'm doing something good. I'm doing something right. I'm helping out. I'm making sure the ark doesn't fall. I'm doing the best I can. But he wasn't doing it God's way. And because of that, he died. And actually, David, in the next few verses, it says David is angry because Uzzah dies. And he just decides, well, I'm just going to leave the ark where it is. So they leave it at Obed-Edom's house. David decided he couldn't bring the ark if it meant death. What's the lesson for us here? What is God trying to show us here about being a place of his presence, about being a dwelling place for the presence of God? Well, the lesson I believe we can see is this. When man tries to control and manipulate God's presence, the result is death. It brings destruction, not usually physical death, of course, in the New Testament, but it brings spiritual death. It brings a death to the flow of the Spirit. It brings a death to the liberty that we have in the Spirit. We need to be really careful that we don't try to control, quench, and manufacture God's Spirit. You know, the Ark of the Covenant, of course, representing the Spirit of God, representing the presence of God. The presence of God was in that ark. God's Shekinah glory was in that ark. And you see, when Uzzah thought, well, I'll just make it go where it should go. I'll just reach out my hand. I'll control what's going to happen. It brought death. And you see, we need to be careful that we don't tell God how he's allowed to move and how he's not allowed to move. That we don't say to God, well, this is the way things have always been in our church. This is the way things are always going to be. We'll sing this amount of songs in this order. Nobody can manifest the gifts of the Spirit. Nobody can speak in tongues. We're going to do things exactly the way we've always done it. You see, when we try to control God's presence, when we try to say this is where it's allowed, this is where it's not allowed, it brings death in the Spirit. It brings a death of liberty. You know, on the other hand, if we try to just manipulate God's presence to create an atmosphere where God's presence isn't there, if we try to, bring in more and more music, if we try to bring in more and more atmosphere, we need to be careful because sometimes we can be creating an image of God's presence. We can be creating a semblance of God's presence. We can be manipulating people's emotions without actually experiencing the presence of God. And we will have death in the same way. We will not have the presence of God. We will bring death to the liberty we have in the Spirit because it all becomes about manipulation and controlling things and creating an atmosphere through our own means. We need to be careful. We need to be careful that we are not trying to control and manipulate the presence of God. And you see, that's the lesson of Uzzah for us here. We want to be a dwelling place of God. We don't want to tell God, this is what you must do. This is what you must not do. We want to be open for him to move. We also don't want to just create an atmosphere on our own and say, well, we're going to just force God in this way, or we're going to create a substitute if God's presence isn't here. We want God to be able to move with complete liberty. So if we're pastors, if we're on a worship team, make sure you are open to the life of the Spirit in your own personal life. Make sure that you are coming into the presence of God, not controlling what God can do, not manipulating what God can do. Uzzah did that, and it brought death. How can we have life? Well, we're going to look more at that tomorrow on the 8-Minute Devotion.
Thank you for listening to the 8-Minute Devotion. We trust you've been encouraged and blessed today. Please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or by visiting the8minutedevotion.podbean.com. For questions or comments, please email us at the8minutedevotion@gmail.com or visit our Facebook page. We would love to hear from you.